Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Weeknight Hero. As always, I'm your GM, Evan. So, while I'm in this interim period and I'm trying to figure out exactly what to do for future videos, I thought I'd come up with a real simple video, which is just some of the homebrew rules that I use when I make adventures and when I play Mutants Masterminds, and just go over, why I'm using them and what it adds to the game. This is not one size fits all. This doesn't have to apply to your characters, but these are just some of the things that I do that work best with my playstyle, my player's playstyle. So the first one being, adventures and sessions are generally kept very short. When I was creating the podcast, it's important to note that it was done with my family members because it was easiest to get them to become invested and involved and devote time to this. So it should go without saying that 3 of the 4 members have some form of attention deficit disorder or ADHD, which makes it very difficult to sit for long periods of time doing a campaign. One of the things that I most hyperfixate on are role-playing games, and even I would have to say that a session that lasts 4 to 5 hours does not work for me personally or for my team personally. So the nice thing about Mutants Masterminds is there does not need to be nearly as much crunch as there is with other games, and you can generally devote a good 20 to 30 minute time period that you can crank out a session, or if you wanted to, even go for an hour, maybe 2 hours. It's important to look at what we're trying to emulate here. A lot of other role-playing games, it might be based on video games. It might be based on long-winded novels that I'm not a fan of. But when it comes to superhero things, I think the most common form that we digest this material in is through comic books, which issues are usually incredibly short. TV shows, which again do not go for more than 20 or 30 minutes, or in movie form, which, if we were to put all the acts of an adventure together, would roughly total out to maybe an hour and a half to 2.5 hours. So it becomes very easy and it's very understood that Mutants and Masterminds can be digested in this format. So you're able to hold attention. You can focus just on the fun bits. And if it might take numerous smaller sessions to crank an adventure out, that's perfectly understood because the people who are playing think in terms of a 20 to 30 minute episode rather than this being one chapter of a grander narrative. Another one that is, it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine in the game system, so I do fudge it a little bit, is that there are no untrained skills. I think one of the severe weaknesses of this game is to have so many skills that cannot be used when they're untrained. And by that I mean, if we were to use something like the acrobatic skill, you would not be able to use your base agility when making an acrobatics roll because it requires training to do it. So you are either stuck with having no bonus at all to your roll and just going by the base roll, or you do have to devote at least 1 point into acrobatics, which means that it's just a zero-sum game. So you are either getting nothing, or you are probably getting a very high bonus because you're choosing to generalize across multiple skills, thinking you might need them, and very rarely does it come to that. I think if we were to look at it from a more meta perspective or from a player and game master perspective, if so many skills are untrained, then I am only going to specialize in the skill that matters to me. By that I mean, if I have to think, maybe I'll put a point in acrobatics, and maybe I'll put a point in sleight of hand, and maybe treatment, and maybe vehicles, and. At that point in time, you might as well just not put anything in them at all and just let the roll do what it may. So my workaround is there are no untrained skills, and in the event that you don't have a skill for it, you instead use your base ability score. Just everything's untrained, and I just don't you ever use the jack of all trades advantage. Now, this is one I came up with. Conditions brought on by affliction, damage, what have you, do not need to be saved at the end of the round to determine whether or not they are still being afflicted by that condition. And what I mean is, if you were to injure somebody with a damage power and they suffer the second degree of failure, they're dazed. And through that, they can only either take a standard or a movement action. Dazed is a very, very limiting condition, and it's one of the ones that sorts of leads up to the end. The way that you do damage and defeat opponents in this game is you kind of stack up conditions, and the more damage you take on, the more likely it is you're going to reach that third degree of failure. And dazed can be a powerful one, because if you get hit with it far too early and you just perpetually fail the save, particularly if you're a will-based character and you have to do a toughness save or a toughness save versus will, you are now debilitated for the rest of an encounter, because you are now at the whim of the dice, and a combat encounter that maybe was a little more normal is now, because of a lucky hit, thrown out of balance, and that really makes it difficult to make campaigns, encounters, and fun encounters for your players. So what I like to do is, if there is a condition, it lasts until the start of their next round, so that gives opportunities for them to, if they've been really debilitated, to recover from it, either players or the villains that they fight. And it gives more of an emphasis on teamwork, because if it's the start of their next round, the condition fails, they still have the rest of other players' rounds. And so it really forces cohesion and teamwork, and it gets people interacting with each other. Now, finally, this got brought up during the speed and movement video, but I've always been an advocate for theater of the mind encounters, particularly because maps can be so time consuming, and most of the time you're designing an area or breathing life into an environment that the players are never really going to interact with in any meaningful way. So I've always been a big fan of theater of the mind, but with this game, there are some difficulties that come along with it, mainly because there's numerical values assigned to so many things, particularly movement and distance in relation to attack rolls and perception checks. So the further away something is from you, it's supposed to inflict a circumstance penalty for attacking rolls, especially ranged attacks. So it forces characters who fight at a longer distance to have to compensate with that by having either better vision or just accepting the lowered attack roll by being more accurate. And this is something that gets lost in translation when you move from theater of the mind from a combat map, because now you're no longer checking where people are at. And as I had mentioned in the combat video, most of the time people just put their players 30 feet away from the nearest villain, therefore making it a near constant trading of blows, which, while totally valid, does make combat much easier, because you're kind of already forcing it to have less tactical value. So what I like to do is to keep things like distance and speed in mind by using it as sort of this orbit around the character. You have your first ring, which is just everything. If the players were to spin around in a circle, that's everything that is, engaged with them. And then if we were to go out beyond that, anything that they could reasonably touch by, leaning over, that's another ring in orbit of distance. And so that would be defined as short. And then you go out from there. So I like to keep things like that in mind with my characters when it comes to theater of the mind, and just not have to make maps anymore. I thought about wraps up this video. I just wanted a more ad hoc, informal one to get us in between the bridge of the new videos that are coming out. I have two major ideas that I think will be really helpful to players coming up in the form of archetype discussions and power discussions, but we'll get more into that in the next video. So see you guys later.